I welcome not only our guests in the room, from several government bodies, policymakers, exam boards, publishers, practitioners, researchers, students, and academics from various universities and departments such as mathematics, education, psychology, and public policy. I will also warmly welcome our hundreds of virtual participants following our live streaming who will also be able to send questions through Twitter. I would also like to thank the many individuals, organizations, researchers, leaders that have collaborated with us on this event, specifically OECD, who has been sharing the framework with us and are now launching the PISA 21 mathematics framework here today. Thanks to our expert panel, who has agreed to share their insight and perspectives on the framework. We are very much looking forward to the dialogue here today, and I will also take this opportunity to give a thanks to Jason Hill, sitting here, who has been convening the conversation leading up to this event and who will also facilitate the panel discussion. Jason will introduce our panelists later. As director of the Oxford Assessment Centre, I'm particularly looking forward to hearing the panel's reflections on the new framework and how to better support students' learning in the future. We are gathered in one of the oldest universities in the world, where the first teaching of students occurred in 1096, more than 900 years ago. Oxford mathematicians like Harley, Wallis, Baden-Powell, Haley, and Hornby contributed to much of the foundation in mathematics and astronomy we today take for granted. And on a more curious note, Charles Dodgen, also known as Lewis Carroll, did not only write Alice's Adventure in Wonderland, but he also was a lecturer in mathematics while at Oxford in the 1850s. But despite the volume of international research in mathematics, we still struggle to bridge research and practice and make high-quality teaching of mathematics accessible to all students, independently of where they live, their gender, ethnicity, or socioeconomic background. We further have an increasing number of students with immigrant backgrounds in countries worldwide. Teaching and assessing mathematics for the future will need to take all these matters into account. As assessment is said to drive the learning and teaching, we further need to discuss how we best assess mathematics, as well as making sure we assess what really matters in mathematics. I appreciate OECD with PISA would like to contribute to the ongoing dialogue, and I'm equally thankful for the very many researchers and participants who are willing to engage in the conversation. Our event will particularly focus upon the following broad aspects. What is the PISA 21st mathematics frameworks? Why is it of importance, and how can we best measure and assess mathematics competence for the future? What kinds of mathematics skills are needed in an increasingly complex and uncertain world? And how can we all contribute to the dialogue moving forward? And as for some of you might want to ask questions while we're here today, I would now like to take the opportunity to start a conversation. I would like you to ask you to all turn around and greet someone next to you that you do not know, and present yourself and share your interest in being here today before I introduce our speakers. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all. I can say that after this reception, thank you all. After this, you will also have time to continue the conversations, and I'm sure we will have a lot to discuss. I'm pleased to introduce Andreas Schleicher from OECD, Associate Professor Jenny Ingram from Department of Education, University of Oxford, and Jason Hill from RTI International, who will chair the panel discussion today. Andreas Schleicher is Director for Educational Skills and Special Advisor on Education Policy to the Secretary General at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. He initiated and oversees the Program for International Students Assessment PISA and other international instruments which create a global platform for policymakers, researchers, and educators to innovate and transform educational policies and practices. He has worked for over 20 years with ministers and education leaders around the world to improve quality and equity in education. Andreas is the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including the Theodor Heuss Prize, awarded for the exemplary democratic engagement in the name of the first president of the Federal Republic in Germany. He holds an honorary professorship at the University of Heidelberg, and for those who follow Andreas, they will also know there are few countries he has not visited in the world. Jenny Ingram is Associate Professor of Mathematics Education at the Department of Education, University of Oxford, a Fellow of Linacre College, and a member of the Mathematics Expert Group for the Programme for International Student Assessment 2021. Her research focuses on the teaching and learning of mathematics at the secondary level. She is the UK observation expert in the 2018 Teaching and Learning International Survey TALIS video study, and she has also a particular interest in researching classroom practices, focusing in particular on classroom interaction and discourse. She is chair of the European Society for Research in Mathematics Education, Language and Communication Group, and co-chair of the Language and Mathematics Working Groups for the International Congress of Mathematics Education. She has published widely in the field of mathematics education and classroom discourse. We are very pleased to have Jenny with us today and very much look forward to her comments. Finally, Jason Hill is a senior research analyst and consultant in the education unit of RTI International, a US-based independent research institute dedicating to improving the human condition. With expertise in education research, Jason has provided services to the US government and private clients for the past 15 years. His work has centered on service and assessments of students, teachers, and post-secondary institutions. He directed a national study of US college students that followed a sample of 35,000 college freshmen through higher education and into the labor market. In 2019, he served as a consultant to the OECD in the long-term strategy planning of PISA beyond 2024. And with these words, I will welcome Andreas Schleicher to the stage. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Teresa, and also for hosting us here today. And I also want to express really my thanks to RTA because the idea of launching this framework was really theirs. It's quite hard to imagine. PISA has gone on for over 20 years. And we've always had frameworks for our assessments, of course, but we have never had a public launch of those frameworks ahead of the release of the results. And we wouldn't have had this here without Jason pushing us to put this debate into the public. And I think it's the right thing to do, that we are actually quite transparent about the assumptions that underpin the assessment right from the start. Because for those who think that mathematics is mathematics, you put 100 people in a room and you get 150 views on how we define mathematics, how it should be measured, how it should be reported. And so it's quite important to be clear and transparent about the way in which this is done in PISA. Just for those who are not familiar with this, to introduce PISA in a nutshell, it's something that goes on every 3 years. It's focused on the age group of 15-year-olds. And the assessment is trying to get beyond looking at what students know. We put great emphasis to seeing to what extent they can extrapolate from what they know, apply their knowledge creatively, even in unfamiliar situations. And that's part of the logic of PISA. Some people say, well, that's unfair. You test students on things that they haven't, been exposed in school. But if you take that view, then, you should consider life unfair, because a test of truth in our lives is not do we remember what we learned in school, but, are we prepared for the next challenges? And one thing that makes PISA special as well is that we collect a lot of contextual data from students as learners, from their teachers, from their parents, and we triangulate all of that information to understand, the context in which students learn, teachers teach, and schools operate. So that's basically what makes PISA different. Here you can see just a map, and that's expanding every day, sort of from a very small set of countries starting this. In 2000, we now have about 80% of the world economy being covered. The one thing that everybody knows from PISA is how it tracks learning outcomes. The last time we published results, that was in science. And the science assessment began in 2006. And that's a long time ago for any of us. I remember it was the year before the iPhone was invented. We didn't have the kind of technologies that dominate virtually everything we do these days. And that clearly has an influence, a deep influence in how we look at mathematics in the future. Twitter was still a sound, the Amazon still a river, but even if you look at some of the top performing systems around the world, like Japan, everybody looks to countries like Japan, is rapidly improving. Yeah, they did make some progress, but actually in 2009 their results were only marginally better than in 2006. And the world didn't stop in 2009. Remember, that was the year when maps became mobile, when cars drove electric. Actually 2011, starting to drive without a driver. Still, top performing systems, just modest progress. And then, think about 2012, 2015, robotics, cloud computing, biogenetics, big data, huge changes in the world around us, science and technology. And you can see education starting to get backward. It's not that students don't learn more things, but when you look at their capacity to think like a scientist. That's the philosophy of PISA. You can see actually we're doing sort of slightly less well, even in some top performing countries. And you think there's something wrong in Japan, you can look at the same thing in a country like the United States, pretty much the same pattern. From improvement to stagnation. And in the case of the United States, all at a lower level. Europe, by the way, not that different either, but there's some countries where you can see sort of things moving forward. You look at their poor cousin in Europe, Portugal, pretty much at the bottom in the 2006, and sort of moving forward. Singapore moving from good to great. Some regions in China we can no longer put on a map. So there is actually movement around the world, continued progress, and that suggests why it's worthwhile to compare those things internationally. That's the idea of PISA, to look at this internationally. And then, of course, everybody asks what's behind those kinds of success factors. The first thing everybody thinks about, is about money or about the time that students spend learning. And yes, that varies hugely across countries. You can see here in the United Arab Emirates, students go close to 60 hours per week studying, either in school, that's the blue segment, or out of school, that's the yellow one. But then you look to Finland here, and you can see it's a little bit more than half that time. Huge differences in the time that students spend learning. But when you look at productivity, learning gains per hour of instruction, you can see in a country like Finland or Germany or Switzerland or Japan, students learn a lot in very little time. Whereas in the United Arab Emirates, they spend a lot of time and learn very little. And that suggests it's not simply, time and money. If that would be the case, we wouldn't have to do international comparisons because we would know the answer. There's a lot more going on that makes it worthwhile to study those phenomena across countries. So that's what we are doing. Now, moving forward, if you think about the future, one thing that we know is technology is becoming more and more universal. We have now more broadband connections in the OECD area than we have people. And that's fueling a dramatic rise in artificial intelligence applications. Same kind of patterns. And the rise of artificial intelligence pushes us to think much harder about what makes us human. How do we complement the capacities that we have created in our computers with human abilities? Think of a field like mathematics. Nobody's going to compete with a calculator or a computer processing data. Where is our human capacity in the field of mathematics? Now, that's a kind of driving force in the frameworks. The industrial revolution taught us how to educate second-class robots. That people are very good at reproducing what we tell them. In the time of artificial intelligence, that is no longer enough. We need to think much harder about the future. If you think about digitalization, it's been incredibly democratizing. Everybody can participate, everybody can contribute. But it's also concentrating power at a rate that we've never seen before. Few companies basically dominating the market. It's incredibly particularizing. The smallest voice can be heard everywhere. You post something on Twitter and everybody can follow you. But it's also homogenizing views at a rate we've never seen before, squashing individuality and cultural uniqueness. Technology is incredibly empowering. There's no better place to see that than right here in Oxford. The most successful companies these days are not created by a big industry, but by a big idea. They have the product before they have the money. Now that's what technology enables us to do. But technology can also be incredibly disempowering. When we become the slaves of algorithms that tell us where to turn left or right, and what to think, what to feel, and so on. And again, that brings me right back into the field of mathematics. Algorithms, computational thinking. Those are crucial elements that when we started with PISA had almost no bearing in our lives. Today they're everywhere. That means we need to change the way in which we look at mathematics, define it, and assess it. And that's you're going to hear from Jenny more about this in a moment. We also know that the kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, are disappearing. Manual skills have been on the decline for some time, but the red line is the worrying part. Routine cognitive skills. Helping people to explain something and then memorize it, repeat it. That's dramatically losing in value. You can see the blue line, non-routine analytic skills, complex problem solving, critical thinking, creative thinking. Those things are on the rise. But also the green line, social skills. What does it mean in mathematics? Problem solving, collaboratively. I think there's a lot of things that we need to worry about when we think about the future of education. Here's some interesting data from PISA that often gets drowned in the debate about average scores. Now, when you actually look at the type of tasks that students can solve well, in green I'm going to show you the ones that you solve with memorization strategies well, and in red I show you where memorization is actually counterproductive. And you can see the red line, the red part is bigger than the green one. It tells you something, but when you look at this by task difficulty in mathematics, and that's not the future assessment but the current one, you can see memorization helps you a little bit on the left side for easy tasks, but as the tasks get more complex, where you need to reason mathematically, have a deep conceptual understanding in mathematics, you can see really how memorization becomes counterproductive. Why is this important? Because the world is moving rapidly from the left side to the right side. And the left side is what your smartphone can do for you. The right side is where, we are still relevant. Well, how do you get to the green line? Actually, we looked at this as well when we looked at the kind of elaboration strategies. Students who can make connections from what they know to what they don't know, who can sort of relate different concepts to each other. Those kinds of elaboration strategies are one of the best predictors we have for students to get the most complex mathematics tasks right. So those things matter, and once again, the world moving from the left to the right. And over time, we develop these frameworks every 9 years, and there's a lot that happens in 9 years when you think about a field like mathematics, particularly in a field like mathematics. Well, and we had a great group of experts helping us to think this through. You may know Joan Ferrini-Mundi, the former head of the National Science Foundation in the United States, Zbigniew Marciniak. I met him first when he was still vice minister in Poland, but he came as actually an expert in mathematics, one of the most revolutionary experts in mathematics, having sort of a very different thinking of what this should be in school. William Schmidt, who has done extensive analysis in the field of mathematics, probably the world's biggest study of national curricula, looking at basically how mathematics is taught in the textbooks and so on. And Jenny, you're going to hear from her just in a moment. And then we have always also experts from the countries working on this. This is one of the, I think, secrets of the success of PISA, that actually it's designed through crowdsourcing. Some people come to the OECD in Paris to look at, what PISA is, and they find a few people in offices, because most of the people are actually working in countries, with countries, and come together as experts to actually define and develop an assessment like mathematics. And that's where I sort of conclude. Basically, this is what they came up with. You're going to find this here. And when you see the way mathematics is conceptualized, is less about what you think from remember from school mathematics, geometry, algebra, calculus. All of those things play some role. But the question behind the PISA assessment of mathematics is really, can you translate a real-world problem into the world of mathematics? Can you use the tools of mathematics creatively to solve that problem? And that's not the end of the story. Can you translate the solution of your problem back into the real world? Those are the kind of questions that PISA asks in the field of quantity, uncertainty, change in relationship, and space and shape. We have chosen sort of those kinds of dimensions because they describe the real-world application of mathematics. Mathematical reasoning at the heart of this. Can you evaluate situations, select appropriate mathematical strategies, draw meaningful conclusions, develop and describe innovative solutions? Those are the kind of things that are important. Finally, all of this is now available also thanks to RTI, really. They have on their own developed a public version of this in order to stimulate debate on this. Once again, when we define mathematics in a field of PISA, there's a lot of normative assumptions behind it, things that are considered more important than others. And so I think making this public will help us to stimulate public debate. But I leave the floor now to Jenny to tell us more about the content of all of this. Thank you.
Will be short delay. Okay, so good afternoon, and I'm here to introduce you to the design of the new mathematics framework, and I'm going to highlight how it builds on the previous frameworks and emphasise what's new, as well as reinforce what the central and key ideas of the framework is. So the aim of PISA is to gain an understanding of the degree to which young people are leaving school with the ability to use mathematics to think about their lives, to plan for the future, and to solve problems, and meaningful problems, problems that are relevant to the important issues that they face in their lives. So PISA is geared all around the idea of mathematical literacy. So this is the definition of mathematical literacy, and there's only been a slight change since the last framework. So what we've done in here is we've highlighted the centrality of mathematical reasoning. Mathematical reasoning has moved from the middle of the definition to the very first thing that you meet in the definition. And that's the centrality of mathematical reasoning in terms of the problem-solving process, but also within mathematical literacy in general. We are continuing the trend of moving away from a focus on basic calculations towards thinking about how students are in a rapidly changing world, driven by new technologies, and that students need to be able to solve problems and work mathematically within this world. The emphasis on mathematical reasoning involves a wide variety of activities that students might engage with. So from the problem-solving cycle, you've got formulate, employ, interpret. So within formulate, you could be interpreting, you could be recognising, organising, making connections, representing mathematics. With employing, you're going to be doing things like deducing, creating, abstracting. And then at the final stage, you've got interpreting, making judgments, making decisions, as well as critiquing and refuting different conclusions. The ability to reason mathematically and to present logical arguments in honest and convincing ways is a skill that we are becoming more and more useful in today's world. Mathematics is a science of well-defined objects and ideas which can be analysed and transformed using mathematical reasoning to obtain conclusions about which we can be certain. Through mathematics, students learn that using appropriate reasoning enables them to reach results and conclusions which they can trust to be true. This kind of reasoning is useful far beyond mathematics, but it is through learning it and practicing it within mathematics that it's most effective. So this is the new model of the new framework, and you'll see at the core we have mathematical reasoning. We've retained the mathematical problem-solving processes of formulating, employing, interpreting and evaluating. We've retained the content domains of quantity, uncertainty and data, change and relationships, space and shape. But we're also emphasising the idea that mathematical literacy is embedded within challenges and problems that students will meet in real-world contexts, whether they are personal, occupational, societal or scientific. We are also emphasising the connection to the 21st century skills that the OECD has been working on, such as critical thinking, creativity, research and inquiry, self-direction and persistence, information use, systems thinking, communication and reflecting. All of these are supported by and developed by mathematical reasoning. The 2021 framework also includes computational thinking for the first time, and this is as it relates to mathematics. So when we talk about computational thinking, what we're talking about within the PISA 2021 framework is the ideas of pattern recognition, of designing and using abstraction, of decomposing problems, and determining which, if any, computing tools might be useful for the analysis or solution of problems. So a key focus of the PISA framework for many years has been the problem-solving cycle, formulating, employing, interpreting and evaluating. So formulating refers to the ability to recognise and identify opportunities to use mathematics. And that includes providing a mathematical structure to a problem that might be presented in some contextualised form. Students need to determine where they can extract the essential mathematics to analyse, set up and solve the problem. And most importantly, they need to be able to translate from the messy, ambiguous, real-world context in which they meet the problem into a mathematical structure or representation that they can then work with to solve. They also need to be able to reason about and make sense of the constraints and assumptions that they have to make in imposing that mathematical structure on a problem. Employing is the ability of students to apply mathematical concepts, facts, procedures and reasoning that they have met in school in order to solve these mathematical problems that they have formulated. They might work on a model of the problem situation, they might be looking at patterns, they might be identifying connections between different objects, and they will certainly be creating mathematical arguments. Interpreting and evaluating refers to the ability of students to reflect upon mathematical solutions, results and conclusions and interpret them in the context of the real-life problem that led to that problem in the first place. So we're talking about taking back those solutions and returning to the context of the problem and determining whether the results are reasonable and make sense in the context of the problem. Now, it is often the case that some other person does part of this cycle. So as a user of the mathematics, you might not be engaged in all three parts of this cycle, and a computer may be doing part of this cycle. So the PISA items in 2021 will reflect this. Some of the items will just focus on one aspect of this cycle. The content domains are entirely unchanged from the PISA framework and have been in place since 2003. In the 2021 framework, what we have done is identified 4 topics within these domains that are for a specific focus. And those are growth phenomena, geometric approximations, computer simulations, and conditional decision making. So growth phenomena, the important thing there is that students recognise that not all growth is linear, and that this has implications for the way in which we interpret the situations that we meet. In geometric approximations, it's important to realise that shapes that we meet today are not patterns. They don't have symmetry necessarily. And that makes the traditional formulas for area and volume, or the ways that we have of drawing and working with shapes, not as useful. And it makes it much harder to work with those shapes. We've also included computer simulations within the domain of quantity. and conditional decision making within the realm of uncertainty and data. There are two other significant inclusions in the new PISA framework, and those include an extension of the scale. So in the 2021 mathematics framework, there'll be 2 additional levels below the current level of the scale in order to enable us to get more valid measure of across the full attainment range within PISA. We're also going to be making use of the computer-based assessment that will be used in PISA 2021. This allows us to have a variety of formats for the questions and the items that we'll be asking, and we've put up some examples of how we might do that on the website, which we invite you to go and look at and comment upon. It also enables us to build in guidance and structure to help students work through some of the questions in a way that hasn't been possible in the traditional paper and pencil format. But it's still important that we retain the emphasis on authentic problems that require students to reason mathematically and demonstrate their thinking. So the PISA 2021 mathematics framework, whilst maintaining coherence with the previous frameworks, acknowledges that the world is ever changing and changing rapidly, and with it the demand for mathematically literate citizens to reason mathematically rather than just reproducing mathematical calculations or procedures. So the aim of PISA with regard to mathematical literacy is to develop indicators that show how effectively countries are preparing students to use mathematics in the everyday aspect of their personal, civic and professional lives as constructive, engaged and reflective 21st century citizens. To achieve this, PISA has developed the definition of mathematical literacy and an assessment framework that reflects the important components of this definition. The mathematics assessment items that will be selected for inclusion in the PISA 2021 assessment will be based on this definition and this framework, and they are intended to reflect the balance between mathematical reasoning, problem-solving processes, mathematical content, and real-world contexts. Thank you. That's a link to the website if you'd like to see more.
Welcome to the frameworks release. I'm excited for this panel. My name is Jason Hill. As Therese shared earlier, I work at RTI International. It's a US-based firm. And it's very exciting for me to be here and be able to participate on this, this panel. So we have a very distinct group, different perspectives on the teaching of mathematics, the importance of learning and mastering mathematics, and the changing nature of math skills required for the labor market. I hope this can be a lively discussion between the panelists and from you, the audience, and we also have an unknown number of people watching live. And so if you have a question on Twitter, please put that question in, and we'll try to answer it. But before I introduce the panel, I would love to get a sense of who is in the room. So could I just get a show of hands? Do we have any math teachers? Yes. Okay. Good. What about academia? Policymakers. Okay. Anyone else that I missed? Shout out. Okay. All right. Well, let me take this opportunity to introduce. You've already met Andreas and Jenny. And I'd like to introduce Lucy and Lori. So Lucy De Gupta has taught math for over 25 years to 11 to 18-year-olds. And she is the strategic leader for math and the director of teaching and learning at the John Mason School in Abington. She has collaborated with members of the University of Oxford's Department of Education on a number of research projects that have focused on classroom discourse and the teaching of functions. And she's also a mentor to teachers in training in school, a professional tutor, and a part-time curriculum tutor. She also established and runs a local teacher network group. So welcome, Lucy. Lori Miles. He has, for more than 30 years of real-world analytic experience in the private commercial sector, working for SAS, which is an American multinational developer of analytics software and analytic services. SAS is also the largest privately owned software company in the world. So in his role as a senior director for SAS UK and Ireland, Lori provides analytic guidance and thought leadership both internally at SAS and with customers across all industries. He holds a PhD in number theory. He joined SAS in 1996 and has worked across a number of industry sectors, including retail banking, and he was responsible for SAS technical management of HSBC globally. Laurie's provided strategic advice for some of the UK's largest organizations. So welcome, Laurie. Thank you. So thank you all four, and let's with the questions. So Jenny, math competence has historically encompassed performing in the classroom, performing operations, memorizing operations, computing operations, percentages, the area and the volume of simple geometric shapes, for example. However, in recent times, the digitization of many aspects of our lives have reshaped how we view math and how we use math. And as you mentioned, there's an increasing emphasis on computational thinking. So why do you think math persists throughout the centuries as a key skill for students? And what is the essence of math that students need to learn today?
Nice, easy question to start off with, thank you. So I think, well, the traditional argument, or one of the most popular arguments, is that maths is useful. And the ability to form simple arithmetic calculations is something that you need in your everyday life. But I would say that that's not holding as much force as it used to, because we now have an app for that. So there's not so much of that needed in our lives. What we need is the skills that are developed through working on the content of mathematics rather than the content of mathematics itself.
Lucy, thank you. Lucy, many people see math as a useful toolbox to be memorized, to learn, and as a result, school curricula in many countries are sometimes confused with a list of mathematic topics to be learned, procedures, and then the students have to practice these discrete problems. They don't have real-world application, and then they're also assessed on them. So I was once a math student, and I have kids who are also in math, and so I often hear the question, and I ask the question, why am I learning this? Why is this relevant? Why do I need to solve for X? I'll never use that. So as a teacher, how do you spark interest in math students, and how do you make math interesting and relevant?
Well, there's one thing that Jenny said, which is that I talk about how it's not necessarily that bit of maths that they're going to use, but the skills that they've used to do that maths are things that they'll have to use. So they're going to get stuck sometime at something. And I think what's quite particular in maths lessons, maybe languages as well, is that in lessons they get stuck. It doesn't happen so much in history or English, because you can say what you think and you can say your opinion, you're not wrong, you're not stuck. And I've had colleagues trying to teach maths who are non-specialists who've suddenly been stuck themselves when what they've tried to explain to a student to do, the student doesn't understand, and then where do they go? So one of the things we're talking about is those transferable skills, about being stuck, communicating what you've done to somebody else, and putting forward your logical argument for something, seeing holes in somebody else's not so logical argument, that sort of thing. Another one is I try and give them like a bigger picture. It's like, so maybe you won't actually start solving equations for X that actually mean something, but I don't know what you're going to be when you grow up, and some of you will end up doing that as part of your jobs. And that phone that you're using is only there because of someone who went on and did some more mathematics, or those roads you drive on, those cars you want to be a mechanic with, somebody's actually designing that. So they can often see that kind of bit of the story, that even though all they're learning is a little bit at the beginning of that, someone else might go on and do some more. And then sometimes we talk about the stories of just how the things have come about. So I think like children are quite fascinated with the weird bits of maths. They love infinity, and they've gone about that forever. Like, they quite like zero. Like, there's weird bits that they just are interested in, and there's a kind of innate solving a puzzle thing that children like to do. So quite often, rather than give them just a cold set of exercises, if we can kind of make there be some purpose to it, as in, can you fit all these pieces together somehow? Even if it's just find the pairs and find the one that's missing. That taps into a kind of puzzling nature that I think children have, that they quite like.
Thank you. Lori, you've been working in business analytics for 30 years. And you personally, I'm sure, witnessed a revolution in computing and what computers are able to do and what we no longer need to do ourselves, both in terms of speed, volume, and even the cost have dropped amazingly. So how is technology, whether it's enhanced computing, AI, machine learning, how is it changing the type of math skills that you think are needed in the workplace? And does it impact your hiring decisions?
It certainly impacts our hiring decisions, but we'll come on to that. So I work for a high-tech company, and so we're looking for people with two different types of skills, one of which is true across all businesses we work with. The one that's a bit weird for us is we want people to build algos, design algos and build algos. So we do need deep dive pure mathematics people to do that. But outside that very niche area, what we need, what our customers need, are people that, yes, can do the maths and understand the maths, but it's actually the soft skills, it's actually the interpersonal and communication skills that are important. And I can only echo what Jenny said earlier, and what I've seen in the framework, it's that reasoning stuff you need. I love the TV programme Billions. Do you watch TV programme Billions, anyone? Yeah. There's a quote in there, and I think the guy says, there's some people that can do the maths, there's some people that can explain the maths. It's the people that can do both that become billionaires. And that's really what we're seeing. We're looking for people with yes, can do the mathematics, have a strong understanding of data and maths, but actually can formulate a problem, formulate a business problem into a mathematical problem that can be solved with data and algorithms, can then explain that to a business person who probably isn't a mathematician, so they can understand the implications of what they've built, understand the implications of the solution. So it's those communication skills that are actually just as important to us as the mathematical skills. And that's impacting the sort of people we hire. I used to go looking for geeky people. I can say that I'm a geeky person myself. Just a person that can sit in a room, sit on a keyboard, solve a problem. I now need someone, yes, can do that, but can also explain it to a business leader as well.
So Andreas, you've talked about government and governments having a role in what students are learning. Do you see a gap in between what's in the classroom and what is described as needed in learning? And can you describe that gap?
Yeah, I think so. When we
Push it up.
when we did our first full mathematics assessment in 2003, we looked at the curricula across countries, and I asked myself, why do countries put so much emphasis on teaching trigonometry? So I went to ask the mathematicians, is this the heart of mathematics? And they told me, no, it's just one specific application in mathematics. If you wouldn't define mathematics around trigonometry. Then I went to the employers and asked them, you need a lot of people with trigonometry kind of skills. And they said, no, never heard about, this is all done by your calculator. Actually, when you want to know the answer to this, you have to go 200, 300, 400 years back in history when people used those scales to measure the size of their fields and construct their houses. And we have kept those things in school because it's so hard to take anything away from school and so easy to add things. But if you look today, computational thinking, do you understand the nature of an algorithm? If not, you're going to become the victim of the algorithm tomorrow. There's so many changes that have not happened, and we see on the one hand, people leaving even with maths degrees, and at the same time, employers say they cannot find the people with the skills they need. I think there is a growing gap between the way we use mathematics and the way we still teach it in schools, because we've sort of crowded out the space. But what is interesting, and that makes international comparisons interesting, that you see huge differences across countries. Here in the UK, you can say sort of maths teaching has become sort of a little bit like a mile wide, inch deep. There's a lot of stuff being taught, but actually at relatively shallow depths. Students learn a lot of things, but actually the depth of conceptual understanding is more limited. At least that's what the PISA results show us. You go to a country like Japan or Shanghai, where students learn fewer things, but at greater depths. They have a deeper level of conceptual understanding. They have a better capacity to apply their knowledge in unfamiliar settings. When you go to a math lesson in Japan, they focus typically on, not 17 or 18 problems, but one single problem. And the teacher will look at that problem from so many different shades and perspectives that students internalize. What is the nature of an exponential function? It's not how do I calculate it, but what does it tell me in terms of growth phenomena? So I think there are interesting differences across countries. Some countries are getting closer to teaching the kind of skills we're talking about, where others are still very much trapped in the kind of 20th century way of learning maths. So yeah, there's variability, but overall, one thing is clear, the world is changing at a much faster pace than our capacity to redesign mathematics teaching. Because again, what governments can do, you asked about that, you can design a curriculum. But the real question is not the intended curriculum, what you write on paper, it's the implemented curriculum, what actually happens in the classroom, and then the achieved curriculum, what happens in the minds of students. And there's also huge gaps between those steps.
So, Jenny, what do you think math teaching should look like in the 21st century, given this, what is needed in the workforce and this gap that Andreas has described? What should the teaching look like?
So, teaching could focus on the learning of stuff, the learning of knowledge, the gaining of knowledge, and certainly Twitter would be encouraging that as a view of teaching. But that doesn't prepare our students for the digitalisation that's happening, the increasing use of technologies, development of new technologies, or the huge amount of data that we're faced with as adults now. So we need maths teachers to be thinking about how are they preparing students to deal with the life that they're going to encounter as adults, even though we don't know what that is yet. So our students are going to have to deal with big issues like climate change, for example. It rains a lot here. We've also got issues with spread of diseases, and how countries run their economies. It's important that as members of societies and citizens, that students are able to understand what they're being told about these things and make sense of it so they can make informed decisions for themselves. And maths teaching needs to do that. Now, there's not one way of teaching mathematics, or I firmly believe that there is not one way of teaching mathematics. There is a variety of possible ways, but it's only successful if the students can pass the exams and work successfully as an adult in a society that is driven by technology and is surrounded by data.
So there's not one way of teaching. There are many ways of teaching math. Lucy, as a teacher, you were earlier telling me about a tension that you feel in the classroom many times teaching. Can you describe that tension and talk about what it means for a teacher of math?
Well, I'm sure this is true everywhere, but as a teacher, you have a certain amount of accountability. And so that leans you towards, I just need to get my students to perform. And often they're teenagers who are not necessarily bought in as much as you might hope. So their self-esteem might be a little bit low. They might not be resilient enough to always be pushed to the limits of their understanding. So often then, as a teacher, period 5 on a Tuesday, you might not really go for some deep probing questions, and it might be better that you consolidate something and you don't get that edginess, because then they'll behave a bit better, and you can sort of dupe yourself into thinking that you had a great lesson because everybody was busy for an hour and they all got on with it. And here in this country, we went through a little bit of a cycle where if your lesson was being observed and they didn't make progress in 20 minutes, then it wasn't a good lesson. And that lingers a little bit in lessons I still observe, where people try and get the children to perform. So the easiest way to do that is find something they've never seen before, show it to them, tell them how to do it, and 20 minutes later they can do it. But they haven't really thought very much about anything, and it's maths that's in my head that's then put into theirs. There's no autonomy on their behalf. They don't feel like mathematics is something that they can do or create. They just copy what they've been shown. Versus what I want to try and do whenever I can, which is to give them a bit of an insight into the beauty of mathematics. And I'm going to tell you one of my favourite anecdotes ever, which is a student I had who was learning some mechanics, who was learning about kinematics. And we were talking about things that were thrown up and then landed lower down than they'd started. And so he was modelling that with his Suvat equations, and then realised that actually he didn't need to work out the time for it to go up to the top and back down to the same level and then down to the bottom. And he said, the maths knows. And he was so happy. And that became a little bit of a phrase for us. But that thing that the maths knows is lost, I think, if all I do is show them ways I know of how to do something that they can then apply. So that's my tension then, is like, yeah, so with these year 10s who think that they're rubbish at maths, who know that maybe they're in the bottom set, and want to just know how to do it. Miss, just tell me how to do it. It's difficult then to probe them a little bit and go, well, I don't know either, let's just try. And that involves creating a relationship with them, knowing very precisely where to pitch the tasks that I'm giving them, trying to kind of cue that up so they know just enough, but there's a little bit for them to do still. And all of that's really, really difficult. And do that to 5 different age groups at, probably 20 different prior attainment levels, when somebody just stole their football on the field at lunch. It's really difficult. And if I had my new beginning teachers at school for 2 hours a day, I could probably help them a lot, but I don't. So I think we've had 3 40-minute meetings so far this year where we can talk about how we might teach ratio or how we might teach statistics. And it's really difficult to then catch up with those other countries that maybe historically have a lot more time for teachers to talk about that and develop their own subject knowledge, and for them to try and be mathematical compared to what we have.
Thank you. I did want to, if anyone has comments as we go between the questions, please.
Otherwise I'll just run on forever.
No. Lori, as someone in the tech industry, are there skills that are more important than math, or are math skills paramount?
I'm a mathematician, so I'm going to say math skills are paramount. But as I said earlier, it's these soft skills, these interpersonal skills, which are now just as important. Problem-solving skills, actually. In order to have problem-solving skills, you need to understand the problem. That may involve speaking to a business-type person, understanding what data you've got, understanding what approach you could take to try and solve the problem using the data and some algorithms, assessing which is the right answer, and then feeding that back to the business. So it's these problem-solving skills, and that whole cycle, I think you spoke about earlier. It's interesting, in my world, we have exactly the same cycle. So that is exactly right. It's exactly what we do every day with our customers. And also, you can't be too academic about this stuff. There is a concept in business of good enough is good enough. If I can build a predictive model that's 80% right today, it's probably better one that's 90% right in 6 months' time, because of the value you lose in that 6 months trying to get it closer and closer to perfection. So that concept of good enough is something we drill into our analysts. So we get them out of university with fantastic maths degrees, and they want to build something that's absolutely perfect. We haven't got time for that. Good enough is good enough. So it's the understanding of that. So it's really problem-solving skills. It really is. And we're in a world where that changes. The biggest thing customers are speaking to me about right now in the AI world is ethics. That's the biggest thing they're speaking about. It is a massive grey area about what's ethical and what's not. And it's something that changes over time. So we also need people to understand that. I mean, I'm old enough to know Sheila's Wells, an insurance company, made a fortune out of selling insurance to ladies because of different risk premiums. No, they're banned. That's discriminatory. You can't just offer insurance to ladies. So it's something that was ethical yesterday, no longer ethical today. So those things change all the time. We need people to understand that and be broad-minded enough to adapt to those sort of changes.
Thank you. Andreas, what can government do to ensure the competitiveness for their workers in the future, to be able to answer the questions that Lori articulated?
Well, governments have a significant influence on what students learn, and the design of curricula, I think, is a good opportunity. But I also think, it goes beyond it. I think it's about creating more engaging learning environments, ensuring that teaching is sufficiently, financially attractive and intellectually attractive, so that you get the best people to become the teachers of your children. I do think governments have a lot of room to do this, to attract the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms, match resources with needs. I do think there's a lot, actually, particularly in the early years, that governments can do. But it's also, I think, it's about being courageous in this. Like when we talk about the future, the tendency, I mean, the status quo in education has actually a lot of many protectors. Now, sometimes we as parents are part of the problem. When you think about math teaching, we are getting very anxious when our children no longer learn things that we felt were very important for us. And we may get even more anxious when they start to do learn things that we no longer understand. So actually we hold things back now. Teachers sometimes are more likely to teach how they were taught than how they were taught to teach. The pedagogy is evolving, and as a policymaker, you can lose an election over education, but you never win one because it takes so much time to translate better ideas into better outcomes. And the exam systems, the gateways in education are hugely powerful. They send very clear signals on the accountability systems, on what students value, teachers value. And again, there we often we trade in validity for efficiency. We design things cheaply to assess lots of people, and then we lose what is really, really important. Or we trade in relevance for reliability. Again, as a kind of politicians here in England, Estelle Morris, the minister, got fired because there was a problem in an exam question. You never get fired for asking an irrelevant exam, which actually maps people back to the past. And I think there is a lot of scope for governments on multiple layers to actually influence this agenda, and I do think it's hugely important. I mean, this is about the future of our countries, of our economies, of our societies. I mean, and I think the point you just bring up, Laurie, on ethics. Technology is nothing but a big accelerator, an amplifier. It amplifies good decisions, good practice, in the same way as it amplifies bad decisions, bad practice. And that brings to the forefront our capacity to actually make judgments. The success in education is no longer about teaching something. It's about helping people develop a reliable compass and then navigation tools to find their way. And again, I think this is a huge task for public policy.
Thank you. I do want to take time to take your questions. So we have 2 mics, I think, traveling. So we do need you to speak into the mic. And we do want you to ask a question. So there needs to be a question mark on the end. And also, if you could introduce yourself. So we have an audience, and then we also have people online who will be submitting questions. So any questions? Right here. Oh, okay.
Ted Mellish, Professor of Human Development at the University of Oxford. We're here launching the mathematics framework, and members of the panel have mentioned curriculum and also teaching. And I'm just wondering whether you have a vision of how the framework maps onto the curriculum across the educational system in typical OECD countries.
And I think this is a very relevant question. At the same time, I wouldn't want, if you take that question to its logical conclusion, and you would want to have, the PISA assessment relevant to the curriculum, you would have to go to the lowest common denominator of national curricula. And we made that choice quite deliberately not to do that. We actually start out from a framework that defines mathematics as the mathematicians believe it to be relevant. And then we actually tolerate that the match to national curricula may be partial. Computational thinking is viewed as very important by the mathematicians, is not yet taught consistently, not yet even in the intended curriculum. So people can take issue with this. They can say, well, you are testing things that we're not teaching, or that we are teaching to a different extent. But that is a deliberate decision PISA made at the very beginning, not to be constrained by the lowest common denominator of national curricula, but to test things that people believe to be relevant. That's also how PISA pushes the boundaries. When the results come out, people will see, oh, we are really poor on those kinds of tasks. Sometimes this is because they're not yet embedded in the curriculum of a country. But this is one of the kind of most critical questions in PISA.
But within a typical OECD country, because of PISA, in a typical OECD country, because of PISA, one can see how the mathematics framework would be attended to by people involved in secondary education, But when I look at the skills that you're talking about, I see the roots of those skills developing way before secondary education starts. And therefore, I see a need for this mathematics framework to be transparently and explicitly made useful across the whole educational spectrum.
I think, yeah, that is another very important point. We actually deliberately did not, focus PISA on what 15-year-olds learn in mathematics. PISA is designed to reflect the cumulative yield of mathematics outcomes. Some, if you find some third grade mathematics in PISA, but it's an applied in very complex context. So actually thinking through the learning progressions. I mean, one of the things that PISA might be doing, as you say, develop a framework that actually tracks that back through the different learning progressions of students. I really think that would be a good thing to do, but it's absolutely true. PISA looks at, the cumulative outcome of mathematics learning, which then, has many antecedents throughout, from early childhood education to school.
I think we have a question in the back. 2 questions.
Junaid Mubin, Director of Education at Wiz Education. Jenny, you spoke about maths being a kind of substrate on top of which we develop a whole range of skills, so maths as a versatile thinking system. And Lucy testified to the appeal of some of the purer elements of maths, the innate satisfaction that students feel from solving puzzles and engaging with weird concepts like infinity. So given all that, why the exclusive focus on world maths? Is that not a needless constraint?
So the focus isn't on real-world mathematics, the emphasis is on real-world context. But in terms of the contexts that are part of the PISA assessment, we include scientific context, so the ability to apply mathematical reasoning in scientific context, in societal context, as well as personal context. So the idea is problem solving has to be done authentically. You need to be solving a problem. That problem might be a mathematical problem, that problem might be a scientific problem, or that problem might be something you face in terms of budgeting, trying to save up to buy a house, those sorts of things that they may not meet now, but will have to meet in the future. So there is an emphasis on real world because it's all about context. It's all about the situation in which people will meet problems, but the skills can also be developed and worked on through working on mathematical objects and mathematical ideas and so forth.
We have 2 questions in the back. One very back. Sir.
Hello, my name is Kali. I am a PhD student. My question is for Andreas. May I ask you, what's the theory of change behind PISA maths? The theory of change behind the whole system?
Well, mathematics assessment is about looking at the extent to which students can master the kind of concepts and ideas in mathematics that are considered to be relevant by the international community as represented by the experts. And then the theory of change is about how we can improve those skills. And that's why PISA connects those outcomes with students' kind of backgrounds, their learning approaches, their strategies, the learning environments in school, the teaching, the schools. So the idea is by understanding where students are and what the factors are that are connected to success, we'll be helping students learn better, teachers teach better, and schools to become more effective. And we are tracking that over time so that we can actually see to what extent that is borne out or not. And that's the idea behind it.
One quick follow-up question. If it's the case, why the World Bank has never ever published the whole set of previous tests, including all questions?
Yeah,
because to me it makes much more valid if everyone knows how you're acquiring that knowledge and skills.
Yeah, we do actually publish a fair share of the items. We need to keep some confidential because we are testing them over time. We want to look at how students' knowledge evolves. So we cannot publish the whole test. We can only publish part of the test. That's been a kind of practice in PISA from the very beginning. But if you look up on our website, you can find a fair amount of the material actually and see Some of this is actually being used in other contexts. There's a program called PISA for Schools, where individual schools can actually use the kind of PISA type tasks from the published material and other elements to assess where they are. So yeah, some of that needs to be confidential for use in future years.
Thanks. Tim is from Cambridge, Cambridge Assessment, and I run a big research unit there. Hi, Andreas. Yeah, I just wanted to reflect on a couple of things, because I'm worried that at times we get pendulum swings in policy and in development. And I think I could be reassuring, Andreas, on this issue of fewer things in greater depth and moving beyond the previous national curricula in England, which Bill Schmidt picked up as being an inch deep and a mile wide. Because, and there's a question at the end of this, don't worry. Because we've actually spent quite a lot of time and resource. It's a multi-million-pound government project to set up 48 maths centres coordinated by the National Centre for Education, Teaching and Mathematics, to build on the kind of deeper processes we see in Singapore and Shanghai in terms of fewer things in greater depth, all the work that Reynolds and Farrell looked at in the late 90s. So I think we've moved well beyond that kind of characterisation of the English system. Of course, in being a cross-sectional study of 15-year-olds, you would expect to begin to see the benefit of this in future PISA surveys. And if we don't, then there's either something wrong with the theory, something wrong with the policy formation, or something wrong with the implementation. But the intent is I think, very aligned to what you said should be a desirable direction of travel. But here's the question. I think people miss some of the middle-rank performers in PISA and where they buck the trend in mathematics, particularly the Baltic states and Kazakhstan. Now, when we read the mathematics curricula, the philosophy of mathematics education that came from the Russian mathematical institutes, and when we read the 10th century and 5th century texts which Shanghai and Singapore based their mathematics on, we do see the kind of balance between application and deep understanding. And we do see rather precocious performance in some surprising places. Now, is what you're saying actually also looking back to some assets of mathematical education in the past that we may have lost?
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. In fact, you could the Eastern European tradition in mathematics, I think, is something that has been under-researched. I think we've put a lot of emphasis to the work in Asia, and I think particularly when it comes to depth of conceptual understanding, I do think that's where I see the richness of international comparison. Actually, they open our eyes. I think the fact, your 48 mathematics center are for me a great illustration of the value of comparisons. It's basically by looking upwards, bringing this back. It's going to take some time to be reflected in the PISA outcomes. One has to be patient on that. You might see a little bit now and then more in the future. But I think that's a good illustration how we can learn from each other. And I do think it's not just, East Asia. I think there are many regions in the world from which we can learn about mathematics education. And I do share there's a risk that, we try to make math education, just popular, make it more interesting, and actually lose some of those kind of key elements. I think that's something that we should guard against. I think we have to always strike a good balance between what I would call the designed curriculum and the negotiated curriculum. There's a lot of forces in society that pull and push us in different directions, the labor market and so on. And I think to keep those elements of design, what are the ways of thinking of mathematics that we really want to maintain in teaching and assessment, I see that is very, very important.
I am endow developmental psychologist in the experimental psychology department here at Oxford. I was rather interested, given that whether one likes it or not, the way in which the media and many elements in educational policy making perceive our use of the PISA results is mainly in constructing league tables of countries and trying to place typically their own country within that league. To what extent do you consider that there are difficulties in making comparisons which are caused, for example, by language differences, social context differences, and other factors, and how do you deal with these when making comparisons?
Yeah, I think the way we deal with this in the construction of league tables is by collecting as much information on the context as we possibly can. We can look at the league tables conditional on the social and economic development of a student, of a school, of a country. We can look at many contextual factors and so on. And we try actually to do that. When you look actually at an OECD report on PISA, you'll find 10 pages on the league tables and 1,000 pages to understand what actually makes schools and systems to be different. Some of that gets lost a lot of that gets lost in the media. In policy making, you have often clearly a very selective use of the results. Now you try to fit, the results into your way of thinking. That unfortunately, happens a lot. But I must actually say, when I've followed that trend since the beginning of PISA, at the beginning it was just the league tables. Today the league tables is one of many elements, but you have even some of the mainstream media who get a lot beyond that to really study, how are students in Shanghai being taught? This is why policymakers, the minister of this country, Elizabeth Truss, actually went to Shanghai. She looked into classrooms. She brought back actually 50 teachers from Shanghai to actually show to teachers in England, how you can teach maths differently. I think those things happen these days by policymakers and so on. So yeah, league tables are at best the starting point for the discussion. But I think if we don't succeed to get a lot beyond it by policymakers in research and surely in the OECD, I think we haven't done our job.
Do we have a question online?
We don't have a question online. We just want to remind those online that they can use the hashtag OECD PISA to ask a question. But we'll take another from the audience.
Hi, Jeannie Ryan, Department of Education. I was wondering, for those of you who've been working on the 2021 mathematics frameworks, and you're talking about the emphasis on the real world context now, and this is, existed, thanks Jenny, this has existed previously, but there's more emphasis on it now and on reasoning skills. I was wondering if you've encountered any pushback in the current iteration of design from national project managers, from country representatives about the topics that you're mentioning that are potentially somewhere between societal and scientific, like climate change, representation of data and verification of data. I'm coming from the United States, so you might be seeing where my perspective is placing me, but some countries might view these topics differently, even though mathematics might not view them differently in terms of algorithms and modeling and things like that. So how have you experienced it so far?
So one of the challenges for PISA is that the assessment is taken by quite a large number of countries that are very different from each other. And therefore, something that might matter in the US may not be of interest in Shanghai or Poland and so forth. So the context always have to be a context that the children taking the test can access and can make sense of. So we might consider a context such as rainfall and climate, but not necessarily climate change. and so forth. I mean, there has not been pushback from the countries that we've talked to and negotiated on this particular aspect of PISA. It's more about the content, the mathematical content. So by shifting to focusing more on real world context, are we losing some of the pure mathematics? We would say no, we haven't lost that mathematics. It's just there's more and more of an emphasis on real world. So it's just a shift of emphasis.
Nabil Ali from the Department of Education in England. I won't repeat what we're doing in terms of aligning with the concepts of PISA, because Tim did a very good job of that. So I'm going to focus more on a specific question that came up from the two things that I think Andreas and me said. There's a lot, one thing you were talking about quite a bit was, of course, greater depth of understanding for a few fundamental things. And another thing that I think Jenny was talking about was the argument probably doesn't hold as much about maths being an absolutely fundamental subject that we need for everything. I'm not saying it isn't, but the argument is weaker than probably it was previously. So is there an argument for, the context is that most OECD countries, not most PISA countries, most OECD countries have maths as compulsory until the age of 18. England is not one of them. Given that we are saying probably this argument isn't as strong about maths being a fundamental subject or an absolute course that we have to study, plus this, we will learn fewer things in greater depth, not a lot, in a lot of depth, or less depth, have we basically got it right? Should we stop at 16? I mean, that's a controversial question, but I just want to get your opinion on that. Should we be stopping at 16, and then from 16 to 18, 16 upwards, it should be much more a specialist subject for those who are really going to be the billionaires who can both understand the mathematics and explain it very well, or actually no, have most of the other OECD countries got it right, that actually we do need to go to 18, and what's your take on that?
Volunteers?
I'll go after you.
Yeah, this issue of, what you make optional or where you enter sort of student choice into the equation is always, relevant, but I do think you can make a strong argument that mathematics is not a tool post sort of 16 for the few become engineers, but actually it's a part of our ways of accessing the tools of our societies today. Math has become really everybody's business. Actually, when Jenny said, math the use of math may be less relevant today, is actually, we have tested it in our survey of adult skills, is the best predictor of people's both employment and earnings today. Math skills. It's not literacy, it's actually the capacity to think quantitatively and so on. So it's a tool that everybody needs to develop at quite a sophisticated level, and the kind of requirements that our societies place on people to understand math, the deep kind of mathematical questions, they arise in importance, Someone mentioned climate change. Well, if we had more people better at math, we would probably talk differently about the nature of climate change and think about those questions in a way. So and if we make all of those things optional, then what you will have is that particularly students from disadvantaged backgrounds will stop studying math because they've never seen a scientist when they were young and small, so why should I invest my energy there? I think this is an important responsibility of society, people who design the curriculum, to think through what are the essential tools that we want everybody to develop. So I am very skeptical to leave all of this up, as a kind of make school a shopping center where people just choose, what is the favorite of the day. This is, in my view, I think, a big, but I see the question, but Jenny, I'm sure you have another perspective on this.
So I'm going to speak as a maths educator and a teacher educator, rather than a member of the PISA MEG for the moment. I strongly believe that everybody should be learning mathematics up to the age of 18, but I think the question is, what mathematics? Okay, that's the real question. The biggest divide for me is the difference between people who need to be able to solve differential equations. There are people who need to be able to do that. There are people who do not ever need to do that, but they might need to understand how to read large amounts of data. Data is becoming a huge issue, and certainly in my role as a teacher educator, I have very few students come my way who are comfortable with data, with seeing data, with working with data, but actually most jobs now involve some work with data. So the question for me isn't should maths be compulsory up to 18, the question is what mathematics should be compulsory up to age 18.
We just grew the numbers of students in our school taking level 3 maths qualifications post 16 by introducing the core maths, and they're really loving it. Students who in year 11 you'd have thought would have like wept at the joy of being able to give up maths are actually like enjoying it, and they're using data, and it's really quite contextual, the course they're following, and they're loving it, and they're kind of telling their friends, and more are trying to swap onto it now. So that is a positive mood. There was a little time, I think, when the government here said, well, you would have to carry on to 18, and then they sort of balked at it and said, no, but you can have a bit of extra money if you get some to do it. And the core maths is kind of spreading now, I think.
I think we had a question here.
Thank you. So, Jenny Golding, I work at UCL, and my research is around the policy-practice interface in mathematics education. So really, building on Tim's comments about the importance of deep conceptual grasp of mathematical ideas before you can solve problems with them, reason with them, before you can access the place of algebra in spreadsheets or the nature of variables or the nature of risk and so on. We've been talking, I think, implicitly about wanting our young people to have both those deep conceptual grasps and the ability to apply them. But some of the areas that you've been talking around, such as computational thinking, such as computer simulation, we don't have a lot of knowledge about how to teach them or how to develop our teachers so that they can teach them effectively. So really it was a question to the active teacher on the panel. What's your core feeling about how we can best set about learning how to teach our young people so that they are empowered in those sorts of ways?
Do you mean as people learning to teach? Yeah. So I think they have to do it themselves. I was quite alarmed when I did a session with the teachers in training at PGC, how few of them knew their way around a spreadsheet. And I think that might be a wave of what happened in England's education system, where computer science came back in. So they're starting to do coding now, but they can't use software very well. And it's a big hindrance in your life as a teacher and as just operating as a professional teacher, but also trying to teach students those things when you're not very confident yourself. So, as I say, we try to run professional development on that, and I think increasingly schools are putting over professional development time to faculties so that they can spend time together learning those things from the people who do know them. And teachers are accessing Saturday conferences and those sort of things, but there's nothing more general from government saying, by the way, a typical teacher's load should not only mean 5 free hours a fortnight, which is the case at the moment, so that you can develop some of these things.
Yeah, very much in the same direction. I think this really comes down to the work organization. I think one mistake we often make is that something new comes up and then we think, we have to retrain our teachers, and then one day they change their behavior, teach something differently, and then students will learn differently. I think that kind of pipeline works less and less the faster the world really changes. I think in today's world, we need to rely on the expertise of people on the front line of teachers. And I think if I look at UK here, if you're a teacher here, you actually have, comparatively speaking, very little time to do anything else than teaching. If you're a teacher in Shanghai, just to mention them again, you spend half of that time teaching in the classroom. And you actually work more hours, but you teach less hours. And that actually means that you have plenty of time to work with your colleagues, to frame good practice, that you are involved in research projects where you actually work with other teachers to think about, how to teach computational thinking or design new learning environment. I do believe to actually address this, ever faster moving world, we need to change the work organization, where actually teaching is not about the delivery of prefabricated knowledge, but it's about the creation of learning environments. And I think that will be very demanding on teachers, but that's the same change we see in many other professions. So I think this is not simply to be solved by changing teacher education.
Okay, I think we have a question time for one more question.
Thank you. My name is Chang Liu. I'm a UCL IOE student. I'm in year 2 undergrad. So my question might overlap a bit with other questions. I've read articles that examined the performance of ethnically Chinese students schooled in Australia and New Zealand. And by controlling the variable of education system, they found that second-generation Chinese students performed significantly better than local students. And their conclusion is that it's the culture of East Asian students that eventually, ultimately decide their high performance instead of the curriculum or pedagogy they used in Shanghai or Singapore or maybe Japan or South Korea. And I think it's also because the culture is about the Confucian philosophy, which emphasizes a lot on hard work and effort, like achievement through effort. And we are also easily humiliated by bad scores or performance. And I think that's a really important component. So I was wondering, after the release of the PISA results, and you find that East Asian countries always usually top the chart. So I was wondering how far is it reliable to borrow or to learn the pedagogy and the curriculum of these countries? Because the main point might be the culture. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, you can look at it this way, but there are a lot of countries doing well. You can look to Estonia and Europe or Canada, and the differences to East Asian countries are not so great. I think there are different countries from different cultures showing really good results. And the question I ask myself often is, to what extent is culture inherited, a reflection of the context, or actually created by what we do? You mentioned, hard work or growth mindset. Now, that's one of the things that we see consistently, that students in East Asian countries, when you ask them, what makes you successful in mathematics, they say this is about, studying hard and, I trust my teacher's going to help me and I'm going to be successful. Whereas in many Western countries, students think that success in math is a matter of talent or inherited intelligence. But to what extent are those things a result of how we design our education systems? For example, in Europe, we track and stream students very early on. Not so great, we put you on a lower performance track, we make it easier for you. In East Asian countries, actually, there's no tolerance for failure. The idea of mastery learning is very dominant. This is about pedagogy. They're making sure that, we vary the way in which we bring students to their goals, but we never will level down the horizon. So to what extent is culture a reflection of those pedagogies, of those environments, as opposed, to something that comes to the, language of culture of people? Those studies are well known that you cite, but even there, you could have the same phenomenon, that where the school system may be quite tolerant of failure, the parents may not. So again, I think we should look at those things carefully. But what convinces me that culture in itself is not such a big driver is the change that we see. When you look at the rapid improvement that a country like Poland has seen, they didn't change the culture, they changed what they do in education. My own country, Germany, had huge kind of disparities in the outcomes. Many of those disparities were closed. Again, not by changing the culture, but changing policy and practice. So I think this question of culture is one that deserves a lot more investigation. But I believe often culture is something that is the result of what we do rather than the context in which we operate. I don't know.
Okay, thank you for the questions. I hope you have more questions, and we'll have a reception soon so you can talk to the panelists individually. We had asked any closing remarks from the panelists, from Andreas?
Well, I think what can I say to close this? I think first of all, I thank you for the questions. Many of these questions really go to the heart of PISA, and it shows why it is so important to have a kind of public dialogue about this. Many of the assumptions that PISA makes are assumptions that are being set by the global community, by experts who sit on the groups, by professionals, by employers who talk about the demand of skills. Now we need to sort of always keep those dimensions in mind, and I think this is what PISA really is. It's a product of crowdsourcing, really. I think that's what has made PISA successful over the years, that it can rely on the expertise in all of the countries that take part. And every country that joins PISA actually adds something to the richness of this process. From every new country, we have learned something that hasn't been there before. And I think that's the value of this process. And many of the questions that you ask don't have easy answers. The question of, how do you prioritize different dimensions of mathematics? How do you include things that are not yet part of the instructional context of the curriculum in a country? How do you make a balance between the design and the negotiated curriculum? How do you reflect the different contexts and cultures? And I think this is something that PISA in itself is an evolving process. We don't have answers to many of these questions, but we are building those answers, and with every cycle, the process will become better. It's also, I think this discussion shows how important it remains for PISA to every decade take a step back and see how a field like math and science have actually changed. Not just keep measuring what we've always measured, but look and see how we might need to reflect on things differently. So thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thank the panelists for this conversation. It's very thought-provoking, some of the questions coming up here, and that's why I'm also very pleased to let you know that you can all continue to ask questions to Jason, Jenny, Andreas, Laurie, and Lucy when we're having a little reception after this release of the framework. But I would also like to let you know that if you take a picture here now on your phone, you can actually download the new PISA framework, which has just been released. And one of the things we love in Oxford is to actually ask critical questions and discuss. And we will sure read this framework and ask critical questions to the foundation, what it actually assesses and how we can potentially improve it, what will happen to the results in 2021 and in 2022 when we know more about the results. And after all, continue this dialogue, which I think we do need between practitioners and professional and academics. So thank you all, and please enjoy this reception now after this event. Thank you.